I'm the first person in my family born outside of the segregated South, first person born outside of the legal confines of Jim Crow. I grew up in the South Bronx at a time when it was the poorest congressional district in the nation. Because of the way it was struck, because of all the gerrymandering and the redistricting, it was extremely poor. So that meant that the Cross Bronx Expressway had just been built and it divided the Bronx. All of you here, I'm sure, know what the Bronx looks like. So it separated the Bronx, it separated those working class white communities from the African American and Latino communities. I grew up on that side of the South Bronx. And what happened was the community was being burned down by slumlords, being divested from business. The Bronx at that time was literally on fire, as many of you remember. But I went to a community school in my neighborhood. It was called a community school. It was community run, community controlled, and it meant that the administration and the teachers had to look like the community. It was a multiracial environment, meaning that there were some white teachers and white administrators there, but pretty much it had to reflect the community. So the community was African Americans, black people coming from the Caribbean, and people coming from Latin America, whether it was Honduras, Nicaragua, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Ecuador. They were coming from all these different places. And in that school, for my elementary education, the teachers understood, we don't have the resources, but they understood their role in terms of developing our leadership. So one of the ways that they helped us to succeed was they taught us in Spanish and English simultaneously. So that meant that math, history, science, art education, physical education was done in Spanish and English simultaneously. So there was no creation of the other. There was no English as a second language or Spanish as your second language. It wasn't even Spanglish. It was constant. I'm going to speak to you in Spanish and I'm going to speak to you in English. What it required was that the African American teachers would have to know Spanish, and obviously those teachers coming out of Latin America would have to know English really well, proficiently. They were also politically conscious, so every morning we were waking up and coming to school and having a sense of our collective responsibility to each other. My ability to succeed was connected to whether or not the student next to me got the work done, and my failure was their failure. So there's tremendous collective consciousness and being rooted in our culture and our history. We ate the foods. The school smelled, looked, sounded like the people from the community that lived there. What began to happen is we tested really, really well. We were masters at standardized testing because we were working with these brilliant administrators. They understand the system. They've been through the system. And so we were doing advanced mathematics, English literature, all these kinds of things. And I was the product of a very well-meaning liberal not-for-profit that said, wow, if these little black and brown kids can do well here, right, Dominique? If they can do well in the ghetto, the real test isn't in the ghetto. The real test is in elite white private institutions. So what we're going to do is we're going to bust you out of your community, send you to Riverdale, which is really part of the Bronx, even though they like to defect from the Bronx regularly, right? So they bust, particularly, that was my story. I got bused to a school in Riverdale. But what happened is through the interview process, the IQ testing, all the standardized testing, what they were doing is they were weeding out people, because if I'm testing everybody in a community of color, I got to be able to separate those people of color who are easy to assimilate in an all-white institution. So that meant we wanted to deal with African Americans, very few Latinos at the time, because we need people who know the game and the rules of the game that are here. We don't want to deal with people who have language issues, so we're not taking people from Latin America or even Haiti for that matter at that time. And we also want to deal with women. We want to deal with females, because we don't want to have to deal with the behavioral issues boys of colors bring to us. And so in that transition, I became what I call a cultural schizophrenic, because and I'm not trying to play with mental health terms, so don't take me like that. I'm talking about what W.E.B. Du Bois is talking about, like dual consciousness, that I had to figure out on the bus ride to Riverdale. How do I have to talk? What do I have to speak? How do I have to represent my group? What do I say when people keep saying, wow, you're really articulate? And then get back on that bus, 2 hours back to my community, and get the right language and the right lingo and the right dap, and have people be confronted with people telling me, you're talking like a white girl. So I had to figure out all those dynamics. What was so profound for me is that this community that had prepared me. I didn't just hatch out of a pot. I wasn't the first smart child of color to come out of my community. But within 6 months of being influenced by an all-white institution, I began to look at the people in my neighborhood and say, what's wrong with you? You don't want the same thing I want. If you just worked hard like I worked hard, you can have the same thing. The institution was always forcing me to assimilate and to adapt. So when Dominique says she's a survivor of prep school, I understand exactly what she's talking about. I understand what Jelani is talking about, how you have to make these transitions and try to keep a community, keep your identity whole and humane. But my parents had to make that decision. Either we keep you in this community that has its issues, but this community loves you and adores you and affirms you, or you get a good education. That's a hell of a decision that families are having to make all of the time. So I was sold the American dream like everybody else. You get this great education, you go to a great school, you get a good job, and there's no such thing as racism. I would find myself dealing with the same dynamics that chased my family out of the South. So when I began to look to buy property here in New York City, I had to look at 70 apartments. We already know what the real estate game is like here in New York because of the prices, but also I was dealing with issues of race. I have a generic name. When I would come to the door, people would say, oh, the apartment is taken, we're not selling anymore. All these dynamics. But again, I was fed this American dream that it's just about class. If you do the right thing, if you go to the right schools, that there's a pot of gold waiting for you. It wasn't until I came to the People's Institute training by way of St. Paul Community Baptist Church that an awakening happened for me, because there's a way in which racism had sucked the oxygen out of my possibilities. That the very person I came to this planet to be, I could not be anymore, because as someone was saying, I think Maurice, I'm always adapting and shifting and trying to fit in and trying to figure out who I'm supposed to be at all times. When I came to the analysis, it gave me clear language. It reminded me that I'm not crazy, that the things I was experiencing, I was not alone. This analysis has impacted my life and is impacting my community.